Hypothetical arguments are divided into pure hypothetical arguments and mixed hypothetical arguments. In a pure hypothetical arguments, all the three constituent propositions, the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion are hypothetical. That is, major, minor, and conclusion are hypothetical propositions. What does it mean? Hypothetical propositions means the proposition starts with if, then. If this happens, then this would happen. So all these three, major, minor, and conclusion, are if then, because it is a pure hypothetical argument. So if then, major premise, if then, minor premise, if then, the conclusion also will be if then. All three will be if then. Now, what is a mixed hypothetical argument? It is also called hypothetical categorical argument. It is also known as hypothetical categorical arguments. It is an argument in which the major premise is a hypothetical proposition. So, in a mixed hypothetical argument or a hypothetical categorical argument, the major premise is a hypothetical proposition. Major premise is a while the minor premise and the conclusion are categorical proposition. That is, minor premise and conclusion are categorical propositions. Let's take an example to understand this. If the soul is simple, it is indestructible. It is indestructible. This is a major premise. And we can see that major premise will be a hypothetical proposition. So major, if the soul is simple, it is indestructible. If the soul is simple, it is indestructible. The minor premise will be a normal categorical proposition. Minor says the soul is simple. Therefore, conclusion is the soul is indestructible. Okay. So there are two valid forms of mixed hypothetical arguments. So even mixed further mixed mixed hypothetical arguments are of two types. So one argument is in the modus ponens. MODUS modus ponens. Or it is also known as constructive mixed hypothetical argument. And then we have the argument in the modus tollens. Or it is also known as destructive mixed hypothetical argument. So we have modus ponens and modus tollens. Modus tollens is also known as destructive mixed hypothetical argument, and modus ponens is known as constructive mixed hypothetical argument. Now, a constructive mixed hypothetical argument is one in which the minor premise affirms the antecedent and the conclusion affirms the consequent. So, in this example, this is in the major premise, if the soul is simple, it is indestructible. In this, the first part is the antecedent. And the second part is the consequent. So a constructive hypothetical mixed argument is one in which the minor premise affirms the antecedent. So let us say P implies Q, P leads to Q, if P then Q. So in this constructive mixed hypothetical argument, what we are doing is the minor premise affirms the antecedent. So this is your statement, if then statement, and then you have the minor premise. So in this, the minor premise affirms that the antecedent is true. The minor premise affirms the antecedent, right? This is the major premise. Major premise is a hypothetical argument, as we know. This would be an hypothetical argument. If P then Q, and then we have the minor premise. It says P, and then therefore we have the conclusion. Conclusion says Q. So the minor premise affirms the antecedent. And the conclusion affirms the consequent. So a constructive hypothetical argument is one in which the minor premise affirms the antecedent and the conclusion affirms the consequent. This argument, so here P is the antecedent and Q is the consequent. And the major premise is the hypothetical argument, and minor premise affirms the antecedent, that is P, and conclusion, which is Q, represented by Q, affirms the consequent. So this is modus ponens. Traditionally, the same could be written as, this is the modern symbolization. This one is the modern symbolization. Traditionally, the same would be written as, this is, now we are looking at traditional way of writing the same thing. If A is B, C is D, and then this is a major premise. It's a major and it's a hypothetical argument. Then we have the minor premise. Minor premise is, because minor premise affirms the antecedent. So a minor says A is B, and then the conclusion will come in. Conclusion will affirm, therefore C is D. So this is a traditional way of writing, and the modern way was as I showed above. The traditional symbolism is not preferred. This symbolism is not preferred. This is because the traditional symbols give the impression that the antecedent and the consequent consists of terms. Okay. The example taken above is that of a constructive hypothetical argument. In the minor premise, the antecedent this is the antecedent. Soul is simple is affirmed. Here it is affirmed. Is affirmed, and in the conclusion, the soul is indestructible is affirmed. Now let us look at the destructive hypothetical argument. So we saw two categories. One is constructive mixed hypothetical argument, and then destructive mixed hypothetical argument. So now we'll look at what is a destructive mixed hypothetical argument. Now we're looking at destructive hypothetical argument. So a destructive hypothetical argument is one in which the minor premise denies the consequent and the conclusion denies the antecedent. Okay, so it will be very clear with an example. If P then Q, the minor premise, it says in a destructive hypothetical argument, minor premise denies the consequent. So this is the antecedent and this is the consequent. So this is a major premise argument. It's a hypothetical argument. Then we have the minor premise. It says the minor premise denies the consequent. It says not Q. Not is also written as this, like this, not Q. And the implication symbol like this is also written as this. Let me redraw this. It will be also written as P implies Q. Okay, and not will be written as per the textbook. So what it means is, it says if P then Q, the minor premise will deny the consequent and the conclusion will deny the antecedent. Not Q, therefore not P or not P. This is also known as modus tollens. Modus tollens or destructive hypothetical argument, because it denies the consequent and conclusion, minor premise denies the consequent and the conclusion denies the antecedent. Whereas in the constructive hypothetical argument, the minor premise affirms the antecedent and the conclusion affirms the consequent. Traditionally, the same thing will be written as if A is B, C is D, and the minor, this is of course we know this is a major. The minor will deny the consequent. This is the consequent. This is the antecedent. So the minor will deny the consequent. So it will say C is not D. And then the conclusion will come in and it will say therefore A is not B. Let's take an example. If matter is indestructible, it is uncreated. If matter is indestructible, it is uncreated. Then the minor premise, this is a major premise. It's a hypothetical argument. Then the minor premise denies the consequent. This is the antecedent, first one. This is the consequent. So minor premise denies that denies the consequent. So it says matter is not uncreated. Matter is not uncreated. And then the conclusion comes in. It says, therefore, matter is not indestructible. Indestructible. Now let us look at the rules of hypothetical arguments. What are the rules? The constructive and destructive hypothetical arguments are sometimes expressed in the forms of rules. When so expressed, they are stated thus. So we have constructive and destructive. These are both hypothetical arguments. Now, first rule is, so there are total 2 rules. So we'll look at both the rules. First rule of hypothetical argument is, by affirming the antecedent in the minor premise, the consequent can be affirmed in the conclusion, but not conversely. So, first rule says, by affirming the antecedent in the minor premise, the consequent can be affirmed in the conclusion. But not conversely, meaning not the other way around. This is important to understand. This is, of course, we know this is a constructive hypothetical argument or modus ponens. Because in modus ponens or constructive hypothetical argument, the minor premise affirms the antecedent. This is the antecedent. And Q is the consequent. So if P, then Q. And this is the minor. This is the conclusion. So minor premise. So what is the first rule? First rule is, by affirming the antecedent, that is P, in the minor premise, this is the minor premise, the consequent can be affirmed in the conclusion. This is the first rule. The conversely is not true. That is, the other way around is not true. An argument in accordance with this rule is said to be constructive or in the modus ponens. An argument in which the minor premise affirms the consequent. If there is an argument where the minor premise affirms the consequent, now instead of the antecedent, and the conclusion affirms the antecedent, is fallacious. So, another situation, a fallacy will occur when if P then Q, then minor premise. What is minor? This is the major. What is minor doing in a fallacious situation? Minor is affirming the consequent instead of the, this is the consequent, Q is the consequent, P is the antecedent. So here a fallacy will occur if the minor premise affirms the consequent and the conclusion affirms the antecedent. Q, therefore P. It commits the fallacy of affirming the consequent. This fallacy is symbolized thus, like this way. So traditionally, one would say if A is B, C is D, normally modus ponens or constructive hypothetical argument would affirm the A is B and the conclusion would affirm the C is D. But a fallacy will occur if the minor premise affirms C is D and conclusion affirms A is B. So here what is happening is the minor affirms C is D and conclusion affirms therefore A is B. This is wrong. It is fallacious. It's a fallacy has occurred. It is fallacious. Let's take an example. If it rains, road will be wet. Road will be wet. Now the minor comes and says, a minor premise states, roads are wet. Roads are wet. This is not a hypothetical. Minor premise is our normal categorical proposition. As you would recollect at the very beginning, it was stated that the minor and the conclusion will be normal categorical propositions, but the major will be a hypothetical statement or a hypothetical argument. So if it rains, road will be wet. Minor states roads are wet. Therefore, conclusion says it rained or it has rained. Okay. So, but the reason why the above argument, this argument in this example is fallacious lies in the nature of hypothetical propositions. The condition expressed in the antecedent, this is the antecedent, if it rains, may not be the only condition from which the consequent follows. This one. Let us explain with the help of the above example. The road, for instance, may be wet due to leakage of drainage pipes. So, roads are wet, but fallacy has occurred. We have fallaciously assumed that it has rained. It could have happened due to faulty drainage pipe or leakage in a drainage pipe. that could have also made the road wet. So this is an example of a fallacy of constructive hypothetical argument or modus ponens. In a fallacy, the minor affirms the consequent in a fallacy, okay? In a fallacious constructive hypothetical argument, the minor affirms the consequent and the conclusion affirms the antecedent. Now let us look at rule number 2. Second rule states, by denying the consequent in the minor premise, the antecedent can be denied in the conclusion but not conversely. By denying the consequent in the minor premise, the antecedent can be denied in the conclusion. This is the same as modus tollens or destructive hypothetical argument. So if P, then Q, then we are denying, the minor premise is denying Q, and therefore the conclusion is denying the antecedent. The minor premise is denying the consequent. This is consequent, and this is antecedent. P is the antecedent, Q is the consequent. Q is denied, that is, the consequent is denied by the minor premise, and the conclusion denies the antecedent. An argument in accordance with this rule is said to be destructive or in the modus tollens. This rule will be violated if the minor premise, denies the antecedent and the conclusion denies the consequent. If it goes the reverse way around, that is, this would be fallacy condition. If P, then Q, then the minor comes in, minor denies what? Instead of denying the consequent, it denies the antecedent, P. It denies the antecedent, and the conclusion comes in, and the conclusion denies the consequent. This is exactly opposite of this. The fallacy, this is a fallacious situation. This is a fallacy or error. This is wrong. This is correct. This side, on the left side it's correct, on the right side it is wrong. It's a fallacy of the modus tollens. If the modus tollens comes and denies the antecedent instead of consequent, okay, if minor premise denies the antecedent, actually it should deny the consequent, but it comes and denies the antecedent, then it becomes a fallacious situation. In that case, the argument will commit the fallacy of denying the antecedent. This fallacy is symbolized as in this example here. Traditionally, it would be written as if A is B, C is D, this is of course we know major, and this is a hypothetical argument. Then the minor, again we are doing an example for fallacy situation, which is wrong. So we are looking at why it could be wrong. So here the minor comes in. Normally it has to deny the consequent, and then the conclusion will deny the antecedent. But here the minor denies the antecedent, right? The minor would deny the antecedent. That is, minor will state A is not B, and the conclusion will state C is not D. So this is wrong. Why it is wrong? Let's understand with an example. If you eat too much ice cream, you will vomit. And then the minor comes and denies what? The antecedent. So it denies, it says, you have not eaten too much ice cream. And the conclusion denies the consequent. You will not vomit. As in the case of the fallacy of affirming the consequent, that is modus ponens, the reason for this fallacy lies in the nature of hypothetical proposition. As we have explained above, we cannot rule out the possibility of alternative conditions leading to the same consequence. Let us illustrate this point by reference to the above example. A person may vomit because, say, he has eaten too many chocolates. That is also a possibility. We may state here that in a hypothetical argument, the antecedent may be the only condition from which the consequent follows. Okay? In a hypothetical argument, the antecedent may be the only condition from which the consequent follows. That is, in this argument, P could be the only condition from which Q follows. In that case, the argument will not be fallacious. It will neither commit the fallacy of affirming the consequent, as in fallacy of modus ponens, nor that of denying the antecedent, that is modus tollens. Fallacy of modus tollens. The expression if and only if before the antecedent indicates that the condition stated in the antecedent is the only condition. So, there could be a situation like this, that P is the only condition from which Q follows. So, in that case, a expression if and only if will be put before the antecedent, indicating that the condition stated in the antecedent is the only condition. So, for example, if and only if the government is defeated, on the floor of assembly, it will be sent out of office. Now, minor denies the antecedent. It says the Congress government in Bihar has been sent out of office. Minor, the government or the Congress government in Bihar has been sent out of office. And the conclusion comes, therefore, it has been defeated on the floor of assembly. Now, this is a valid modus tollens, or yes, this is a more valid modus ponens, because it says the government in Bihar has been sent out of office. So it is affirming the consequent. It will be sent out of office. So this is the consequent, and the first part is the government is defeated on the floor of the assembly is the antecedent. And the minor premise, what is it doing? It is affirming that it has been sent out of the office. This is modus ponens, or constructive hypothetical argument. And the conclusion says, therefore, it has been defeated on the, that is, the government has been defeated on the floor of the assembly. This argument is valid because the condition stated in the antecedent is the only condition. But again, here also, if you see, this is the only condition in which, if the government is defeated on the floor of the assembly, definitely it will be sent out of the office. Therefore, if the consequent is affirmed, now we and the minor premise. Therefore, if the consequent is affirmed in the minor premise, the antecedent can be affirmed in the conclusion. Right? This is our normal situation. In a hypothetical argument, either the antecedent or the consequent or both of them may be negative. When the negative antecedent is affirmed, it will remain negative, and when it is denied, it will become affirmative. Similarly, about the consequent as well. However, the form of the argument will remain the same. We find that the minor premise may not affirm or deny either the antecedent or the consequent. It may affirm or deny a special case falling under either the antecedent or the consequent. So let us understand this by way of an example. If a member of parliament is declared bankrupt, he loses his seat. Mr. A has not lost his seat. So what we are doing is it's a negative statement. Mr. A has not lost his seat. Whereas in the hypothetical argument, the consequent, this is the consequent, was positive. He loses his seat. But now here we are using a negative statement, has not lost his seat. So therefore, Mr. A has not been declared bankrupt. Okay. Of course, this is what are we doing? This is a destructive hypothetical argument or modus tollens. One more example we'll take. If one is guilty, one trembles with fear. Now, the accused is trembling with fear. So we are affirming the consequent. And when the minor premise affirms the consequent, this is the consequent. And the conclusion affirms the accused is trembling with fear, is a consequent. Therefore, the accused is guilty. But one could be trembling for other reasons also, not necessarily because one is guilty. So this is fallacious, because if normally one when affirms the consequent, okay, normally in a modus ponens, the minor premise, this is the minor premise. Minor premise affirms the antecedent, but here the antecedent is being affirmed here in this example, and then the conclusion is being affirmed by the conclusion is affirming this is the conclusion. The conclusion is affirming the antecedent, which is wrong. So this argument commits the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Fallacy of affirming the consequent. Minor premise should affirm the antecedent and not the consequent. Okay, so this is wrong example. This is a fallacious argument. Now let us look at disjunctive arguments Earlier we saw the rules of hypothetical arguments. Now we'll look at disjunctive arguments and the rules of disjunctive arguments. So, a disjunctive argument, also called disjunctive categorical argument, is one in which the major premise is a disjunctive proposition, right? And so, in this disjunctive argument, also called disjunctive categorical argument, is one in which the major premise is a disjunctive proposition, while the minor premise and the conclusion are categorical proposition. So it works like this. To be in very short to explain, in a disjunctive argument, the major premise is a disjunctive argument, P or Q. This is or, symbolized as this, P or Q, while the minor premise and the conclusion are both categorical propositions. Let's take an example. He is either careless or dishonest. Then the minor premise, which is a, sorry, not therefore, this is a major, this is a destructive, sorry, not destructive, disjunctive argument where we are using the or statement. So is either careless or dishonest. Then the minor, which is a categorical proposition, and the conclusion. So minor says he is not careless, denies this. He is not careless. Therefore, he is dishonest. Okay. A disjunctive proposition states alternatives. These alternatives may or may not be exclusive. A disjunctive proposition merely asserts that at least one of the alternatives is true. However, traditional logicians maintain that a disjunctive proposition may express exclusive alternatives also. The minor premise of a disjunctive argument may either affirm one of the alternatives or deny it. On this basis, there are two forms of disjunctive arguments. These are modus ponendo tollens and modus tollendo ponens. So depending on what the minor premise does, that is whether it affirms or denies the disjunctive argument. The minor premise of a disjunctive argument may either affirm one of the alternative or deny it. Okay, so here it has denied. In the first case, in this example, it has denied. On this basis, there are two forms of disjunctive arguments. One is modus ponens tollendo, modus ponendo tollens. And the other is modus tollendo ponens. These forms are often expressed as rules of disjunctive arguments. So disjunctive arguments are of two types: modus ponendo tollens and modus tollendo ponens. Now this depends which one it is. It depends upon whether the minor premise of the disjunctive argument, this is the disjunctive argument. The major premise consists of a disjunctive argument, and depending on the minor premise, whether it is affirming or denying, we have two types of disjunctive arguments. One is modus ponendo tollens and another is modus tollendo ponens. Now let us look at the rules of disjunctive arguments. What are the rules? Okay, so what is the rule? We have two rules here as well. The first rule states, by denying one of the alternatives in the minor premise, the other alternative can be affirmed in the conclusion. That is true. So, for example, P or Q. Now, by denying one of the alternatives, if we deny not P, then we can say it is Q is true. But if we say not Q, then we are saying therefore P. So this is by denying one alternative. But first the alternative has to be denied. These are two alternatives, either P or Q. In the minor premise, the other alternative can be affirmed in the conclusion. So therefore, we affirm in the conclusion one of the other alternatives. Now there are two alternatives in the minor premise. Since either of these alternatives may be denied, by applying this rule, we get two forms of disjunctive arguments. They are symbolically expressed as P or Q, not P, therefore Q, or not Q, therefore P. So, not Q, therefore P, not P, therefore Q. So, there are two types of arguments that we can get from. This is also P or Q. So, these two types of arguments we can get. So, let us take an example. First, we have to understand what is the rule of this. First rule is by denying one of the alternatives in the minor premise. The other alternative can be affirmed. In the conclusion. Now let us look at the example. Students are either intelligent or hardworking. Okay. This is the either statement. Yeah, either they are intelligent or hardworking. Now the minor premise denies. Minor premise denies John is not intelligent. And then the conclusion. What will the conclusion do? Here it has been denied. So the conclusion will affirm it because it's an or statement. It's a disjunctive statement. Major premise is a disjunctive statement or an argument. It's a proposition, disjunctive proposition. So, if John is not intelligent, then John is hardworking. We'll look at another example. Same thing. Students are same thing, either intelligent or hardworking. Now, we say minor premise states John is not hardworking. Therefore, conclusion states John is intelligent. The disjunctive argument which obey this rule are said to be in modus tollendo ponens. Modus tollendo ponens. So we had two types, modus ponendo tollens and modus tollendo ponens. So when the denying part comes, of course we'll go to modus tollendo ponens. And when the affirmation part comes, then we go to modus ponendo tollens. So basically modus ponendo tollens anyways affirms. And modus tollendo ponens denies. Denies what? Either of the two alternatives. And affirms what? Affirms either of the two alternatives. So, when it is denied, when the minor premise, this is the minor premise, this is the conclusion. And when the minor premise denies, then it is said to be in modus, M-O-D-U-S, modus tollendo ponens. modus tollendo ponens. These arguments, that is, all arguments in the modus tollendo ponens, are valid arguments. It does not matter whether the alternatives are exclusive or not. Now we have the second rule. Second rule states, by affirming one of the alternatives, by affirming one of the alternatives in the minor premise, the other alternative can be denied. Where? In the conclusion. Provided the alternatives are exclusive. Okay? By affirming one of the alternatives in the minor premise, the keyword here is affirming. By affirming one of the alternatives in the minor premise, the other alternative can be denied in the conclusion, provided the alternatives are exclusive. For example, P or Q, either P or Q. Now we are affirming it is P, therefore so this is the minor premise. So states P, it says P, that is affirms the P, therefore not Q or not Q. You can use this symbol, not Q. Now the other situation would be P or Q, and we are saying Q, therefore conclusion is not P or not P, like this. So when the affirmation comes, it is modus ponendo tollens. Okay. Now let us look at example. Either he violated the law or he was arrested unjustly. Okay. Either he violated law or he was arrested unjustly. This is the major premise. Okay. Now we have the minor, and minor will affirm, right? Here minor will affirm. Minor will affirm either of the two alternatives. That is, he did violate the law. If he has violated law, then the other can be denied, that he was not arrested unjustly. If he violated the law, he was not arrested unjustly. And alternatively, if the consequent is affirmed, that he was arrested unjustly, then the antecedent is true. That is, if he was arrested unjustly is true, then it can be said he did violate the law. He did not. Okay, so let's look at slowly, we'll go gradually. So first we say, first the minor premise affirms he violated the law. He violated the law. Therefore, the conclusion will state, if this is true, then this will be denied. So, he was not arrested unjustly. In the second situation, where we are denying the consequent, where we are affirming the consequent. Okay? This is the first part. In the second part, minor premise is affirming the consequent. Second alternative. He was arrested unjustly. He was arrested unjustly. So what will be the conclusion? If he is arrested unjustly and this is true, then he has not violated the law, or he did not violate the law, will be the conclusion. Okay, there are the two alternatives. This is the one alternative. This is the second alternative. The disjunctive arguments on the basis of this rule are said to be in the modus ponendo tollens. These are in the modus ponendo tollens. Modus ponendo tollens. These arguments are valid only if the alternatives are exclusive, otherwise they are invalid. It is clear from the above that disjunctive arguments in the modus tollendo ponens are valid. On the other hand, arguments in the modus ponendo tollens may be valid or invalid. So, modus ponendo tollens can be either valid or invalid. But modus tollendo ponens are always valid. They are valid when the alternatives are exclusive. That is, in modus ponendo tollens, if the alternatives are exclusive, then it is always valid. Otherwise, it is invalid. When the alternatives are exclusive, the disjunctive arguments may be symbolically expressed by using AND symbol, this symbol. The symbol stands for the exclusive sense of OR. We shall symbolically express the arguments in which the alternatives are exclusive. So let us look at rule 1 through symbols. Symbolically. So we are looking at first modus tollendo ponens. This is P or Q, and modus tollendo ponens we know that the minor premise denies one of the alternatives. So it says not P, therefore Q. Okay, and the other alternative was not Q, therefore P, right? And the rule 2 example was this is modus polendo tollens. It states P or Q. Now, modus polendo tollens affirms. It says P, therefore not Q. And in the alternative, we have P or Q, and we say Q, therefore it cannot be P. So, again, through a few examples. It says he is either honest or dishonest. And the minor affirms one of the alternatives. He is honest, and the conclusion will deny it. He is not dishonest. And if we say same situation, the minor states he is dishonest, then the conclusion definitely has to state that he is not honest. Okay. If the alternatives are exclusive, all kinds of disjunctive arguments are valid. Now let us move to what is dilemma. Dilemma also is considered to be a mixed syllogism. So dilemma is a mixed syllogism. As in the case of hypothetical and disjunctive arguments, in dilemmas too, the propositions are not of the same relation. However, a dilemma is more complex than hypothetical and disjunctive arguments. A dilemma combines into one argument hypothetical and disjunctive reasoning. It may be defined. So basically, a dilemma combines into one argument both the hypothetical and disjunctive arguments. Okay, and it may be defined as an argument, that is, dilemma can be defined as an argument in which the major premise is formed by the conjunction of two or more hypothetical propositions. The minor premise is a disjunctive proposition which either affirms the antecedent or denies the consequent, and the conclusion is either categorical or disjunctive. Okay, so this will be easier to understand. through the example. A dilemma, it may be defined as an argument, that is, a dilemma may be defined as an argument in which the major premise is formed by the conjunction of two. The conjunction means and symbol. By the conjunction of two or more hypothetical propositions. So there is a if then two hypothetical propositions are there in the major premise, and it is formed by the conjunction of two or more hypothetical propositions. Now, the minor premise is a disjunctive proposition. It is a disjunctive proposition which either affirms the antecedent or denies the consequent. It either affirms or denies affirms the antecedent or denies the consequent. When a minor affirms the antecedent, what is it called? Recollect. It is known as modus ponens. And when the minor denies the consequent, recollect what it is known as modus tollens. Major in a dilemma, major is made up of two the major is formed by the conjunction of two hypothetical arguments or propositions, and the minor is a disjunctive proposition which either affirms the antecedent or denies the consequent. And the conclusion is either a categorical or disjunctive argument or proposition. So we'll understand this by an example. If men are morally perfect, it is unnecessary to preach socialism. It is unnecessary to teach socialism. Ignore the spelling mistakes if they do occur, because I am writing faster. If the men are morally perfect, it is unnecessary to preach socialism. So earlier I said there are two hypothetical statements, propositions combined with a conjunction or formed using conjunction, which is the and symbol. If this and if this, like that way. So, if men are morally perfect, it is unnecessary to preach socialism, and This is where the conjunction comes in. And this is a major premise. And if they are not morally perfect, it is impossible to preach it. Okay, so this is like your first hypothetical situation and second hypothetical situation. Hypothetical situation 2. If this, and if this, so it is like this. So this is your if. So first hypothetical situation is this one. Is this one first hypothetical situation, and stands for this, and then the hypothetical situation 2. Now what did it say next? Next rule was about the minor. Minor is formed by disjunction either affirming the antecedent or denying the consequent. So either men are morally perfect or not. As we saw earlier, it is made up of either categorical or hypothetical statements. Minor is made up of minor either affirms the antecedent or denies the consequent, whereas conclusion would be either a categorical or a disjunctive statement. So what we are doing is, it says either affirms the antecedent or denies the consequent. So in this, one is it affirms are morally perfect. It affirms men are morally perfect, affirms the antecedent. What is the antecedent? The first part was the antecedent. That is hypothetical statement 1 was the antecedent. Men are morally perfect. So are morally perfect. Or not. Then they are not morally perfect. Okay. So this was like your 2 affirming the antecedent or denying the conclusion. Okay. Now what will be the conclusion in this case? Conclusion would be either a categorical or a disjunctive statement. So the second part we have to take, if we are saying if men are morally perfect or not, then we have to say it is unnecessary to preach socialism or it is impossible to preach it. Conclusion will be it is, that is either, first we have to write, either it is unnecessary to preach socialism or it is impossible to preach it. So what has happened is the conclusion has become the second part of the statement. So it was like this. P implies Q, R implies S. Okay? P implies Q, R implies either P leads to Q, if P then Q, if R then S. Then minor states P or R. Minor states P or R. I'm explaining this symbolically, how it means. So first part was P, if P then Q, if R then S. This is the major premise, this is the minor premise with the disjunctive statement, and this is using conjunctive statement. If P then Q and if R then S, P or R, therefore conclusion would be Q or S. Okay, this is complex, this is known as complex constructive dilemma. This is known as complex constructive dilemma. So, in the example shown here, right, major is there, minor premise is there. The major premise is formed by the conjunction, that is the end of two hypothetical propositions. So, so we saw this was the first hypothetical proposition, this is the second hypothetical proposition. The minor premise affirms the antecedent, that is the first part, and denies so minor premise affirms the antecedent of the hypothetical major premise, while the conclusion affirms the consequence. The conclusion is a disjunctive proposition. So the minor premise affirms the antecedent of the hypothetical major premise. So these are the major premise of the hypothetical. If men are morally perfect, if they are not morally perfect, it affirms both of them. And the conclusion, what it does is, it denies while the conclusion affirms the consequence, that is, it is unnecessary to preach socialism, or it is impossible to preach it. So let us look at the different kinds of dilemma. One we have already covered, which is the complex constructive dilemma. A complex constructive dilemma is one in which the minor premise affirms the antecedent, and the antecedents as well as the consequent in the major premise are separate propositions. Okay, it is symbolically represented like this. with a comma like this. So, a complex constructive dilemma is one in which the minor premise affirms the antecedent P or Q, P or R, and the antecedents as well as the consequents in the major premise are separate propositions. The antecedents and the consequence are separate propositions. It is symbolically represented like this. Now let us look at the traditional form also of this. If A is B, C is D, this is the first one, and if E is F, G is H, either A is B or E is F, therefore either C is D or G is H. We can look at through an example. If compulsory legislation against prohibition is obeyed willingly, it is mischievous. And if it is obeyed unwillingly, it is useless. If compulsory legislation against prohibition is obeyed willingly, it is mischievous. And if it is obeyed unwillingly, it is useless. Then, so basically what has happened is, we can use a symbolical form here. P leads to Q and R leads to S. So in this, P is if compulsory legislation against prohibition is obeyed willingly. Q is mischievous. This is the legislation against prohibition is obeyed willingly. This is your P. It is mischievous is your Q. If it is obeyed unwillingly, this is your R, and it is useless is your S. Okay. Now, the minor statement would say P or R, that is, legislation against prohibition is obeyed willingly or unwillingly, then it is mischievous or it is useless. So, the minor premise would say either compulsory legislation against prohibition is obeyed willingly or it is obeyed unwillingly. Keyword here is or it is obeyed unwillingly. This is your minor premise made up of a disjunctive proposition. Okay, and this major premise is made up of conjunctive proposition. So what will be the conclusion? Conclusion will be R or S. It is mischievous or it is useless. That is, compulsory, that is either compulsory legislation against prohibition is mischievous or useless. This is your conclusion. What is a simple constructive dilemma? So we have simple constructive dilemma and complex constructive dilemma. Then we also have simple destructive dilemma and complex destructive dilemma. So we are looking at complex constructive dilemma. Okay, constructive dilemma. So we had earlier seen what is a constructive hypothetical argument and destructive hypothetical argument. Constructive hypothetical argument was also known as modus ponens, and destructive hypothetical argument was also known as modus tollens, right? Modus ponens and modus tollens. So, in modus ponens, the minor premise affirms the antecedent, whereas in modus tollens, the minor premise denies the consequent. So right now what you have covered is constructive. We have covered complex constructive dilemma in this part. Now we'll look at simple constructive dilemma. Simple constructive dilemma. So let us look at the simple constructive dilemma. In this kind of dilemma, the minor premise affirms the antecedent and the consequence in the major premise are identical. In this kind of dilemma, that is simple constructive dilemma, the minor premise affirms the antecedents and the consequence in the major premise are identical. This kind of dilemma is symbolically expressed as so let us understand this with an example. If P then Q, if R then Q. If R then Q. If P then Q, if R then Q. So, therefore, P or R, not therefore, this is a minor premise. This is a minor premise. P or R, therefore conclusion will be Q. So, in this kind of dilemma, that is simple constructive dilemma, the minor premise affirms the antecedents, and the consequence in the major premise are identical or common. That is, the major premise, the consequence in the major premise are identical, that is common. So let me just write this again properly. So what it says is the minor premise affirms the antecedents. Then what are the antecedents? P and R are the antecedents. And the consequence in the major premise are identical or common. So, simple constructive dilemma is symbolically represented like this. If P then Q, if R then Q, then this is the major premise. Minor premise affirms P or R. Conclusion is Q. Okay, so let's take an example. If you are fated to live, if you are fated to live, medicine is unnecessary. This is the major premise. And if you are fated to and if you are fated to die, medicine is unnecessary. Okay, so we have the similar situation. If you are fated to live, medicine is unnecessary, and if you are fated to die, medicine is unnecessary. So, if you are fated to live, this is P. Medicine is unnecessary, this is Q. And this is the and symbol. If you are fated to die, this is R. Medicine is unnecessary, this is Q again. So, P implies Q and R implies Q. Then the minor premise comes in. It says P or R. What is P? P is if you are fated to live. If you are fated to live, or if you are fated to die. Okay, in both this thing, the conclusion will be Q, which is Q is medicine is unnecessary. Okay, so this is simple constructive dilemma, and the complex constructive dilemma, just to recollect, was P is Q, R is S, then minor says P or R, conclusion states Q or S, whereas simple states, this is complex, constructive, on this side we have simple, constructive. Simple constructive is P or Q, R, and R implies Q. P leads to Q, if P then Q, and if R then Q. Then minor states P or R, and the conclusion states Q, like this. I hope this is clear between simple and constructive dilemmas. Now let us look at simple destructive dilemma. Let us look at the third option, which is simple destructive dilemma. It states that in this form of dilemma, the minor premise denies the consequent. The minor premise denies the consequent and the antecedent in the major premises are identical. The minor premise denies the consequent and the antecedent in the major premises are common. So this would be like this way. P implies Q and P implies R. So this is the major. What does the minor do? Minor denies the consequent. So not Q or not R. Not Q or not R. Therefore, not P. Right? Not Q, not R, therefore not P, because P implies Q. So if you're denying Q, you have to deny P also. This is the opposite of the simple constructive dilemma. This is simple destructive dilemma. In simple constructive dilemma, we affirm, it affirms what? It affirms the antecedent. And in simple destructive dilemma, minor affirms the antecedent by the minor premise. And in the simple destructive dilemma, minor premise denies the consequent. So Q and R are consequents. Let us understand this by way of an example. If you go to Kashmir, you must pay for the ticket. And if you go to Kashmir, you must pay for the hotel bill. This is like a major premise. P implies Q and P implies R. So if you go to Kashmir, this is your P. If you go to Kashmir, it is P. You must pay for the ticket. It's your Q. And you must pay for the hotel bill. This is your R. So the minor premise denies. Minor denies. Not Q, not R. Not Q or not R. So if not Q, not R, that is Q is what? Either you cannot pay for the ticket, you must pay for the ticket. You cannot pay for the ticket, either you cannot pay for the ticket or you cannot pay for the hotel bill. Then, therefore, that is the conclusion. You cannot go to Kashmir. This is your simple destructive dilemma. Now, let us look at complex destructive dilemma. In this kind of dilemma, the minor premise denies the consequence. And the antecedents as well as the consequence in the major premises are separate propositions. So, how do we represent this? It says the minor premise denies the consequence, and the antecedents as well as the consequence in the major premises are separate propositions. That is, P or Q, R or S. P, if P then Q, and if R then S. Then denies. What does this is the major. What does the minor do? Minor denies the consequence. So these are the consequence, not Q, not S. Not Q or not S. Then, therefore, the conclusion is not P or not R. Not P or not R. So, let us take an example. If we are to have a peaceful society, if we are to have a peaceful society, we must not encourage competitive behavior. And if we are to have a progressive society, we must not discourage competitive behavior. Okay. So in this, we see if we are to have a peaceful society, this is your P. We must not encourage competitive behavior. This is your Q. And if we are to have a progressive society, this is your R, we must not discourage competitive behavior. This is your S. So P implies Q. If P, then Q. And if R, then S. This is your major premise. Your minor premise states what does minor premise do? It negates or it denies the consequence. So it says not Q or not S, which means not Q means we must not encourage competitive behavior. So not Q means we must encourage competitive behavior. That is, either we must encourage competitive behavior or this one, or we must encourage, what is S? Must encourage competitive behavior. What was the fourth one? We must not discourage competitive behavior. We must not discourage competitive behavior. So here the first one was if you read the statement again, it says we must not encourage competitive behavior, whereas here it says we must not discourage competitive behavior. So this will go reverse and it will say we must discourage it because we are denying it. We must discourage it. Discourage competitive behavior. This is our minor premise denying the consequence. The conclusion is not P or not R. What is not P? Not P is either we are not to have a peaceful society or we are not to have a progressive society. This is exactly denying the consequence. It will be observed that the consequence in the major premise are negative. Therefore, while denying them in the minor premise, they will become affirmative. Consequence in the major premise these are the consequence Q and S. Q is we must not. We must not. So this is negative. In the major, the consequences are negative. While denying them in the minor premise, when we are in the minor premise, when we are saying not Q or not S, They'll have to become affirmative. That is, we must encourage competitive behavior or we must discourage so must is a affirmative kind of statement. Now we'll just summarize all four. One is simple constructive dilemma, complex constructive dilemma, simple destructive dilemma, and complex destructive dilemma. How are all based? So the simple constructive dilemma, the major premise of that is P or Q and R or Q. Okay. Minor premise is P or R, therefore Q. Complex constructive dilemma is P or Q. This is a major premise. R implies S. Therefore, P or R, not therefore, P or R, therefore Q or S. In the simple destructive dilemma, because here we are affirming. In this constructive dilemma we are affirming, and in the destructive dilemma we are denying. We deny the consequence. In the destructive dilemma we deny the consequence, whereas in the constructive dilemma we affirm the antecedent. So, what is the simple destructive dilemma? It says P implies Q, P implies R. Then we deny the consequence in the minor premise, not Q or not R. When we do that, the conclusion is therefore not P. And in the complex destructive dilemma, we have P implies Q and R implies S. That is, P leads to Q. If P then Q, if R then S, and the minor premise denies the consequence, not Q or not S. Right? Not Q or not S. Therefore, not P or not R. So, this is the difference. So, in this simple constructive dilemma, the consequences are the same. In complex, the antecedents and the consequence all are different. Similarly, whether it is constructive dilemma or destructive dilemma, we have to write all separate terms. Whereas here in the simple constructive dilemma, we have the consequence common, whereas in destructive dilemma we have antecedent common. Okay, P and P antecedents are common in the destructive dilemma. In the constructive dilemma we have consequence common. Okay. So this is all for simple and complex constructive and destructive dilemmas. Now let us look at different kinds of dilemma. Kinds of dilemma. So we have 4 types of dilemma. Then we have to rebut also, then refute, and that will be the end. And this chapter comes for around 13 marks in total, or that is in the long answer. And one definitely question comes every year from last 5, 6, 7 years. This question does come in the paper for 13 marks. So you can easily score 13 marks from this question, from this chapter. So what are the different kinds of dilemma? In fact, 13 marks for only in the long answer, but you will also be able to score in maybe in situational questions, as well as in the short notes, as well as in the 2 sentence. So you may easily score around 20 marks or so in this particular chapter if you thoroughly do this. And it is very, very easy and interesting also. So what are the different kinds of dilemma? Like mixed hypothetical arguments, dilemmas may also be either constructive or destructive. It could be constructive or destructive. We know what is constructive and destructive. Constructive affirms the consequent, and the destructive denies the constructive affirms the antecedent, and destructive denies the consequence. So what is a constructive dilemma? It is one in which the minor premise, which is a disjunctive proposition, affirms the antecedent, and the conclusion affirms the consequence. Okay? So, a constructive dilemma So, in a constructive dilemma, minor premise is a disjunctive. Is a disjunctive proposition. And it affirms the antecedents. And the conclusion affirms the consequence. In a destructive dilemma, minor premise denies the consequence. And the conclusion denies the antecedents. Now let's get into rebuttal of dilemma. So rebuttal of dilemma. So there are two ways of meeting the argument presented by a dilemma. Firstly, we may prove that the argument is false. Secondly, we may present the opponent with an argument which proves the opposite conclusion. So there are two ways of meeting the argument presented by the dilemma. Firstly, we may prove that the argument is false. Second, we may present the opponent with an argument which proves the opposite conclusion. So either we prove the argument is false or we prove the opposite conclusion as true. The former is called refutation of a dilemma. So this is refutation of a dilemma. While the later is called its rebuttal. This is rebuttal. We shall deal with the rebuttal first. The rebuttal of a dilemma consists in presenting a counter dilemma which proves the opposite conclusion. The process of rebuttal of a complex constructive dilemma is this. The major premise of the counter dilemma is formed. So we have to understand this. So we are going into rebuttal now. Okay. The rebuttal consists in presenting a counter dilemma which proves the opposite conclusion. Now, the process of rebuttal of a complex constructive dilemma. Complex constructive dilemma. Remember what is complex constructive dilemma? It is in a complex constructive dilemma, that is in complex, we have, first we write both the statement PQ, RS like this, and then we say P or R, minor premise would state P or R, and the conclusion would state Q or S. Okay, so this is the complex constructive dilemma. Now, the process of rebuttal of a complex constructive dilemma is this. The major premise of the counter dilemma is formed by transposing the consequence of the two hypothetical propositions. The quality of the consequence is also changed. You will understand this by the exact example. Thus, the rebuttal of a complex constructive dilemma will be symbolically expressed as, so this will change to P not S and R not Q. Then the minor premise will again remain the same, P or R, and conclusion will be therefore not S or not Q. This is the rebuttal of a complex constructive dilemma. Okay. This part is the rebuttal of above. So it is correct. P implies not S because R implies S. If you see here, R implies S. So P implies not S, correct. And R implies not Q, correct. So P or R means not S and not Q. So let us understand again. The rebuttal of a dilemma consists in presenting a counter dilemma which proves the opposite conclusion. The process of rebuttal of a complex constructive dilemma is the major premise of the counter dilemma, that is this, of the counter dilemma, this one, is formed by transposing the consequence. We are moving S, we are transposing it here, and the Q, we are moving from here to here, and S from here to here. That is, S we are moving it in place of Q, and Q we are transposing in place of S. Okay? Of the two hypothetical propositions. The quality of the consequences are also changed. So this S becomes not S. This Q becomes not Q. Okay? Now, let us take a complex constructive dilemma and rebut it. So we'll start with an example first. If poetry is true, it is disguised history. And if poetry is false, it is not disguised history. So this is your one statement, that is the major premise. This is your P, this is your Q, this is R, and this is S. Now we know what happens when we say P or R. P or R. If poetry is true and if poetry is false. So we start with either poetry is true or false. Okay, either poetry is true or false. Then this will be like your P or R, which is your minor premise. Then comes your conclusion, which is not S, not Q. So S is what? It is not disguised history. So now this will turn to either it is disguised history, right? Or your Q. It is disguised history. So it is not disguised history, or it is misleading. What was the original thing? Okay, so this is this I made it. I've written it wrong here. This should have been. This should have been. If the poetry is false, it is misleading. Okay, so either poetry is true or false. This is minor premise. The conclusion will become not S or not Q. So not S means it is misleading. So we have to write it is not misleading. Either it is right. So either it is not misleading or since it says it is disguised history, we have to say it is not disguised history. The same method is applicable to the rebuttal of complex destructive dilemma. Same way we have to do complex destructive dilemma. Now we should recollect what is complex destructive how do we write? First we write P, Q and R, S, right? Then the next will come P or which one will come? P or complex destructive dilemma is written as how? So we are negating in complex destructive dilemma, we negate the consequent, so not Q. So not Q, not S. Therefore, not P or not R. Now, how do you rebut this thing? So, The same method is applicable to the rebuttal of a complex destructive dilemma by negating the antecedents and transposing them. So in this we have to negate the antecedents, that is the P and the R, and transpose them, that is P goes in place of R and R goes in place of P. So not R implies Q, right? And the P comes here, not P implies S. Then the minor would be, because we are denying the antecedents, so it will be not Q, sorry, consequence. We in the destructive dilemma we deny the consequence, so not Q, as stated here, not Q, not S. Therefore, if not Q, then it has to be your R, and or not S, then it has to be P, or P. This is the rebuttal. So let's take an example. If he is clever, he will see his mistake. And if he is honest, he will acknowledge it. Now, how do you rebut this? This is our actual example. So first we have to mark all of them. What is P, Q, R, S? So if he is clever, is our P. He will see his mistake, is the Q. And if he is honest, this is R. He will acknowledge it. That is, he will acknowledge the mistake. So this is S. Now, we know if you have to do the rebuttal, we have to say not R implies Q, not P implies S. So how will we write it? Not R. So if he is honest, so if he is not, either he is not honest, no. So we don't start with either. The first, our actual major premise will be if he is honest, so that will become not R. If he is not honest, right? If he is honest will become if he is not honest, because we are saying we are negating the R. So if he is not honest, he will see his mistake. Q will remain as it is. He will see his mistake. And now we go to not P. P is if he is clever. So if he is not clever, then we go to S. S is you will acknowledge it. You will acknowledge it. So this is the entire major premise. Okay. Now we come to our minor premise. This is our minor premise. So minor premise states not Q or not S. So what is Q? He will see his mistake. So not Q. Not Q means either he will not see his mistake, he will, instead of saying he will, he does not. Because why? Because it's a categorical proposition. Either he does not see his mistake, or we go to negating the S, or he will not, or he does not acknowledge it. Then comes the conclusion. What is the conclusion? Conclusion is R or P. So R is what? R says he is honest. Either he is honest or he is clever. This is the conclusion. The rebuttal of a complex destructive dilemma has no force. Rebuttal has force when we accept the antecedents and show, by transposing and negating the consequence, that the stated consequence need not follow. Therefore, rebuttal is more natural in the case of complex constructive dilemma. But if we consider the formal aspect of argument, rebuttal of complex destructive dilemma has as much value as that of complex constructive dilemma. That is, both have force, complex constructive dilemma and complex destructive dilemma. Both have force, but the complex constructive dilemma is more valid than the complex destructive dilemma. So this is all about rebuttal, how to rebut the complex constructive dilemma and complex destructive dilemma. Now we go to this, we did rebuttal. Now we do refutation. We refute it. The force of a dilemma consists in the fact that, generally speaking, dilemmas are formally valid. Though it is possible that a dilemma may involve a formal fallacy, such formal fallacies are rare. However, the formal fallacies of dilemma are: the fallacy of affirming the consequence, the fallacy of affirming the consequence. This you will find from modus ponens, where modus ponens does the affirmation of the antecedent. But when the modus ponens affirms the consequent, then the fallacy of affirming the consequent occurs. And then we have the second, the fallacy of denying the antecedent. So this is modus tollens, but when the fallacy of modus tollens happens, then the fallacy of denying the antecedent happens. So we know that modus ponens affirms the antecedent, whereas modus tollens denies the consequent. When the opposite of modus ponens happens, then we get the fallacy of affirming the consequence. And when the opposite of modus tollens happens, we get the fallacy of denying the antecedent. These are in fact the fallacies of a mixed hypothetical argument, which we did earlier. Now, the formal fallacies of dilemma are the same as those of the mixed hypothetical arguments, because dilemma is a combination of mixed hypothetical arguments. Apart from the above formal fallacies, dilemmas are refuted by pointing out defects in the premises. Dilemma is no more powerful than its weakest premise. Now, the major premise of a dilemma is formed by the conjunction of two hypothetical propositions, right? That we saw earlier. The major premise of a dilemma is formed by the conjunction of two hypothetical propositions. So far, we have been solving all the problems through conjunction in the major premise. For example, as I showed you earlier, P implies if P then Q, if the and conjunction means and symbol. We can do it by dot also, putting a dot. R implies PQ, R implies S, right? And then we add, this is your complex, and then we have simple. Simple would be whether it is complex, either it is complex constructive dilemma or complex destructive dilemma. It is the same format for the major premise. But for the simple constructive dilemma simple, and simple destructive dilemma, it is a little different. In the simple constructive dilemma, which we saw earlier, the antecedent remains the same. So, P or Q and R or Q. Right? Whereas in the simple destructive dilemma, the antecedent remains the same. That is P or Q and P or R. P or Q, P or P not P or Q. P implies Q, if P then Q, and if P then R. So this is the diagram for the complex constructive dilemma and simple dilemmas. That is both simple constructive and simple destructive. Now, the major premise of a dilemma is formed by the conjunction of two hypothetical propositions, which I explained here. This is the conjunction, right? In a dilemma, it is assumed that the consequence necessarily follow from the antecedent. If it is shown that either of the consequence does not follow from its antecedent, the major premise is fallacious. So if Q does not imply, you can very clearly see P implies Q, or P, if P then Q. So Q necessarily follows from the P. Okay, that is consequent necessarily follows from the antecedent. In all four, you can see in all four types, it is shown that either of the consequence, if either of the consequence does not follow from its antecedent, the major premise is fallacious. Okay, this fallacy is called the fallacy of taking the dilemma by the horns. So when P does not imply Q, or R does not imply S, or if P then not Q, or if R then not S, then this is called taking the dilemma by the horns. This is the fallacy, the name of the fallacy. Taking the symbolic expression of complex constructive dilemma, this fallacy may be represented thus. So, symbolically, we write it like this. If P then Q, but also followed by something. So we don't know what it is followed by. So this is questionable. Okay. And R, if R, then S, but followed by something. We don't know. It is not clear. What P implies Q, but we don't know what it implies. What is the meaning of this Q? And then the minor premise is, of course, P or R. Conclusion will be Q or S, but this will be a question mark because we don't know. This will be a the minor premise of a dilemma is a disjunctive proposition. This is a disjunctive proposition. This is a minor premise. The minor premise of a dilemma is a disjunctive proposition. Dilemma proceeds on the assumption that the alternatives are exhaustive, that it is exhaustive. This means that in the situation referred to by the dilemma, there are no other alternatives. If P then Q only, no other alternative should be present. When the alternatives in a dilemma are not exhaustive, that is not complete, the dilemma commits the fallacy of escaping between the horns of the dilemma. Taking the symbolic expression of the complex constructive dilemma, this fallacy may be represented like this. If P, then Q, if R, then S. Okay, then we have the minor premise P or R. This is the minor. Now, if the minor premise has an error of say P or R or T, an additional alternative comes up, then this is a fallacy. Therefore, Q or S. But what about this alternative? There's one more alternative here. This creates a fallacy. It must be stated here that refutation is possible only on examining the argument materially. That is why Eton points out that when dilemma is fallacious, it may be said to fail or to be unsuccessful rather than be formally fallacious. There's a reason behind the peculiar name of the fallacies. A dilemma is compared to a bull, and a bull has horns. The horns of a dilemma are unpleasant consequences. When the minor premise is shown to be defective, like this one escapes the unpleasant consequences. Therefore, the fallacy is named escaping between the horns of the dilemma. When the major premise is fallacious, when the major premise is fallacious, it is shown that the consequences do not follow from the antecedent. These consequences do not follow from the antecedent. That was in the previous example. This one. When the major premise is fallacious, it is shown that the consequence do not follow from the antecedents. In this way, the dilemma is shown to be powerless. Since the dilemma is compared to a bull, showing that the consequence do not follow is taking the dilemma, that is the bull, by the horn being the dangerous consequences. Now, we will take some dilemmatic arguments and refute them. If economic conditions are unfavorable, the law is sure to fail. And if economic conditions are favorable, no legislation is necessary. then we say either economic conditions are unfavorable or favorable. Either economic conditions are unfavorable or favorable. Okay, because this is our minor premise and it is P or R. So this would be our major premise from here till here. It would be major and P or Q and P or P Q R S, right? So our therefore the conclusion should be either, so this is if economic conditions are unfavorable, this is your P, the law is sure to fail, this is Q. If economic conditions are favorable, this is your R, and no legislation is necessary, this is your S, P, Q, R, S. Now, P or R. So P is either economic conditions are unfavorable or R, which is if economic conditions are favorable. So either economic conditions are unfavorable or favorable. This is of course your minor premise from here till here. So either the law is sure to fail or no legislation is necessary. In this dilemma, both the premises are fallacious. If economic conditions are unfavorable, the law is sure to fail. The consequence in the major premise do not follow from the antecedent. The consequence in the major premise do not follow from the antecedents. Even when economic conditions are unfavorable, the law may not fail. So what it says is, if economic conditions are unfavorable, the law is sure to fail. Similarly, even in favorable economic conditions, legislation may be necessary. If economic conditions are favorable, no legislation is necessary. So both the major premise, both the antecedent and the consequence are fallacious. Therefore, the dilemma commits the fallacy of taking the dilemma by the horn. The dilemma also commits the fallacy of escaping between the horn of the dilemma. Economic conditions may be neither favorable nor unfavorable. Okay? Economic conditions may be neither favorable nor unfavorable. Favorable and unfavorable are not contradictory terms. Therefore, the alternatives are not exhaustive. Now,